All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Green College and welcome to the Resident Member Series. My name is Nico and I have the privilege of being one of the co-conveners alongside Aaron of our Resident Member Series talk this season. We're delighted to have Danny with us, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology here at UBC. We'd like to start off and begin our time with an land acknowledgement, situating ourselves on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people, and acknowledging that this place has always been a place of learning long before this college has been established. The Green College Resident Member Series provides an opportunity for resident members to speak about their research or topics of their choosing in a friendly and warm environment. And so thank you all for coming as well. We're excited to have a great, talk. I've been working on my Spanish a little bit for the title, and then we'll follow up that talk with opportunity for Q&A at the end. And so please do feel free to have a question at the end and we'll open up the floor. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dani to speak on her talk, Poner, el Cuerpo, Environmental Activism in a Fumigated Town of Argentina. Dani, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, and Nico and Aaron for making this possible. I would like to start by adding to your land acknowledgement and as an invitation to think about what does it mean for us to be settlers in a stolen land. And for me, this entails to join anti-colonial efforts, inter-island and elsewhere. Today marks a year of a genocide. And yeah, like we've seen a lot of violence lately, and especially in this last few weeks with the escalation of violence in Lebanon, bombing of Syria, Iraq, Iran, Yemen. And I would like to invite all of us to reflect about what does it mean for us to have the privilege of being here and in an institution that is complicit with the genocide, not only because there's a normalization of the collaboration with these institutions that are complicit in the genocide, but also because all of our tuition money is going to weapons manufacturing companies are making the very same bombs are causing all this mass destruction. So before talking about my own research, I wanted to read a poem that was written by Rafat Anaret. He was a professor of world literature in Gaza, and he was killed by the an IDF strike on December 6th of 2023. So it says, if I must die, you must live, to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strength, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel's there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a tale. So as we mark a year of the genocide, I was hoping to interpellate all of us to really consider how our practice and our work and everything we do is contributing to this tale and what story is being told and for whom. So yeah, I'm gonna go to my topic, which is somewhat related. So this talk is about my research that I did for my master thesis, which I recently finished. And thank you. And So because a lot of you are not anthropologists, are not familiar with, I'm gonna do like a very quick explanation of what anthropology is, and I'm like apologizing in advance to the anthropologists in the room for what am I gonna do, because it's really hard to do this in a minute. So it might not do justice to anthropology, but bear with me. So anthropological research is about studying human culture and behaviors from a with qualitative methods and in a micro scale. So if we compare with sociology, it would be sociology uses more a macro level of seeing things and using more quantitative methods. We usually use qualitative methods, which entail participant observation, which means participating in the events we want to observe. And also like this idea of like participant observation, because we're being part of it, we're also being an influence of what we're seeing. It's not that we're like there, like from the outside, seeing exactly what would happen. We're part of that dynamic. And a lot of like open-ended interviews. This is a lot of what I did in my fieldwork. And this idea of like having a micro level scale does not imply to be reductionist. It's like you still have to have like a holistic approach and consider all the historical processes, economic, cultural, everything that like it's contributing to make the processes that we're trying to analyze to be how they are. There will other sources that we'll still use, but the core of it would be participant observation, open interviews, at least what I did. Yeah. Also, yeah. The whole like micro level scale is something that I particularly like struggle a lot, and like I kept trying to like bring a lot of stuff to the table, but you kind of like need to narrow it down. So a really key concept for anthropology is reflexivity, which it's about trying to figure out how your own identities and biases and experiences and the values you have influence the way that you are interpreting and doing your research. So just like a quick snap of who I am, I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. This is a pretty big city, has 4 million people, so I'm pretty urban, you could say. Like I've spent most of my life in a city with a lot of people. I'm a Trotskyist activist. I will not explain what Trotskyism is because it will take me too long, but it's basically the leftist part of like Marxism. I've been an activist for 14 years. I did my training in anthropology in the University of Buenos Aires, and I was also teaching a class called Introduction to Scientific Thinking for 5 years, which got me very caught up like in the whole like debates of STS, science and technology studies, and how science works and all this stuff. And also something to have in mind, while I was doing my field work, I was going through my own process of like having chronic pain. I ended up like having to have surgery. And I have like really reflected on how like that affected me in a way which when I was listening to people talking about their own pain and their own like health processes. So my research is basically trying to address some of the activism that is organizing against fumigations in Argentina. Argentina was the first country in Latin America to approve the use of transgenic soybeans. This means that they modify a seed of soybean to survive the spray of a herbicide that kills everything else. So this makes it more quote unquote efficient because you don't have to separate, like the weeds from the crop that you're trying to like produce. And it really boosted like the production of the country. It really changed the whole landscape in not that many years, maybe in a decade, 2 decades now. It's been 3 decades now. It has changed dramatically. And now, currently, Argentina is like the 3rd largest soy exporter in the world. 84% of the soy that is being produced is being for export. And we do have like the highest glyphosate application rate in the world. Glyphosate is the chemical component that is the main component of the Roundup, which is the herbicide that is used to produce in conjunction with this like seed. These are produced by Monsanto, by the way, which now is owned by Bayer. So there's a lot of scientific studies that have proved that the use of glyphosate and this expanded and intensive spraying of agrochemicals have caused a really like high increase in the cancer incidence in a lot of the rural towns. It's up to 2.5 more times of cancer and death by cancer, among like many other problems, but these are like kind of like the core issues, along with like spontaneous abortions and birth defects that is causing on the populations. So when I was trying to think about my own research, I was thinking about how there was all these groups that have started to voice themselves against this model and the consequences that they were suffering, and how like from the stage and all of the governmental agencies, there was an official narrative that would like absolutely deny anything of this was happening. So the official narrative would be, again, in a snapshot, that the incorporation of agrobiotechnology would imply progress and development, and this could like help to end the hunger in the world and produce food for everyone. And they usually portray the environmental activists as they're anti-science and they're like in the past, right? They're rejecting progress and they don't want to be like in modernity or like. So when I was thinking about like initially my project, I was very inspired by these ideas of how different groups were mobilizing different narratives that will justify their arguments with scientific arguments. So I kept thinking like, what does it mean science for all these different groups? And I was very inspired by Andrés Carrasco, he was one of the first like scientists that made public a scientific study that he had like come to the conclusion that this was indeed harmful. He's an embryologist. He was like making a lot of like experiments and discovered that there's like a lot of embryonic mutations. So this was actually going in line with what the communities were saying. He went public with this and he was like heavily criticized. And one of the things he said, and it really struck a lot of people, was this idea that there's a lot of evidence, but there's also a lot of living proof of this, what he said, a sanitary emergency. And that is in Spanish, but it says, what's happening in Argentina is almost like a massive experiment, right? Like, so he was like, their experiment with people in a massive scale. And he was a big influence for a lot of like scientists in Argentina that now are actually devoted to like create knowledge that will like back up this claims. And they denominate themselves like belonging to the ciencia digna, which means worthy or dignified science. So as I was saying, my initial questions were more about the role and characteristics of science that were being mobilized by these two different groups, like grassroots organizations and the scientists, activists, and then on the other side by agribusiness representatives and governmental agencies. This was clearly very influenced by my own experience teaching in like a class related to SDS. And then what happened, and like I think it always kind of happens, especially in anthropology, is I kind of like change a little bit my gaze and my focus during my fieldwork, because I started like to encounter things that seemed like more significant, at least for what I was experiencing there. So this idea of Poner Cuerpo, which I will explain, that there it says like embodied experiences, but it's not like a complete accurate thing. And yeah, I will go to this ideas of chemical regime and structural violence. And so again, like this is this slides what before should have been before. So a lot of these ideas that I was having about how science is being mobilized we're coming from a reflection of like how this narrative of like neutrality and objectivity works. And there's like different ways of approaching it in Latin America. Specifically, this is again in this Carrasco. He's very much naming like the dominant technological development as an instrument of control and colonialism. Like he's very much pointing to the core of how this plays a role, and this idea of like, you know, that science, it's not ideological. He would say that science is very much ideological. And he would like talk about this idea that Latin American people have to have their own science that goes and addresses the problems that we have and the issues that we want to address. And he talks about a situated place, which kind of resonated a lot with me when I started like seeing at to this idea of situated knowledge that was also developed at John Haraway, and standpoint theory that was developed at Alison Wiley. So it's basically this idea that people that are on the margins or like the dispossessed have the ability to see things that people that are like in the core of privilege don't. This doesn't mean that because you're on the margins, you see it, but it means that you have an access to see some things that might not be so easy to see to people that are not experiencing this. So then I went on and did my fieldwork. So I'm gonna have to, excuse me for a moment. So this is where I did my fieldwork in Argentina. No, it's not showing. Okay, give me a moment. Can I put playing here? Is it animating?
I'm going to try something from my end, if you want me to.
Okay, no, it's okay. It was like a cute like video that was approaching to the place that I did my fieldwork, but it's also on that map. So I did my fieldwork in the province of Santa Fe and in some towns that were close to Rosario, which is right there in the middle of like the very dark green that you're seeing on the map. And that's a map that is showing the production of soybean in the country on 2022. So I went basically to the eye of the storm, like where they do like the most amount, like one of the largest producers of soy in the country, next to this other two, like you can see that's Buenos Aires, and the one that is long like a boot is Santa Fe, and then next to it is Córdoba. Like these are like the three provinces that have like the most amount of soybean production. So I work basically with some environmental grassroots organizations that are like in tiny towns, are like very close to Rosario, which is the biggest city in Santa Fe. It has a whole like port complex from which most of the soybean that is produced in the country is being exported. It's actually the biggest like agro export node on the world. And it's interesting because in the places that I was working with, there were like these tiny towns that have so much problems, right? Like they wouldn't have tap water, they wouldn't have like proper roads, and they were like 14 kilometers away from one of the richest cities in the country. And yeah, this is like, we don't like, anyway, so I did like a lot of interviews. I participated in a lot of meetings. I went to a ceremony. I did like a tour for some of these towns. I was able to see a lot of like blends of schools and places that were working until maybe 4 decades ago. But then with this whole change, a lot of people had to like start leaving the spaces and start going to the cities nearby. So I basically work with two groups, if I would have to like put it like two main groups. On the one side, I was working with scientists. I did some interviews to different scientists, and I went to a social environmental health conference in the National University of Rosario. That was actually organized by one of the people that I'd interviewed, which is Damian Barceñasi. He's in medicine, he's a doctor, and he organized a survey all across the province of Santa Fe and some other provinces, mainly Santa Fe, of like all these different rural towns. And he organized that from the university. So he was doing like the final project of the program. So anyone that would be in conditions to get their degree would have to do this final project. So they would go and like participate in this survey in which they were like going house by house, asking people what were their affections, what was going on with them. Why? Because these towns don't have hospitals themselves, there's actually no statistic, like there's no information to know what is going on with the people in these towns. And then there's no way to actually, like, they could do it, but they don't do it. And so there's no epidemiological like devices to actually know or identify what are the affections that all these people are having. So Damian organized that. They did like for over 10 years. And he and his team are the ones that got to this, what I was showing you before about like this study that got to the conclusion that there's like 2.5 more times cancer and death by cancer in these towns. And I also interviewed that Rafael Lakmanovic, he's an exotoxicologist. He works with fish and frogs and stuff like that. And he actually also, his team found that one of the fish that you can find in the Salado River, which is a river that is in this province, is one of the most contaminated in the world. Again, it has like a combination of several agrotoxics, not only glyphosate, but a bunch of them. And they also like talk a lot about how usually when people address this, they will just say, oh, like this is the amount of glyphosate that you can take before you die. But then there's no actually measurement of how that, like, what's the negative consequences of like a chronic exposure of this and the accumulation of it and how that interacts with other agrichemicals and other contaminants like in the environment. So I work with them. They are the ones that like are in this collective that I was explaining, Ciencia Digna, that was like heavily influenced by Andres Carrasco. Andres Carrasco died in 2014. And then I did also an interview with someone that was actually referred by the grassroots organization. And then I work mostly, other than these interviews that I did, with a grassroots organization that are like neighbors from 4 towns that are close to Rosario. And I did, I think, like 15 interviews and practicing observation. And I was basically talking to them about their own experiences, how they experience this, how they experience their own health affections. One of the main like activists, like it's a horizontal organization, but then there was like someone that was like very active. And that was a person that would take me to places and like explain a lot of things. And they were actually going through their own like medical problems, and they had like an infection of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is also heavily associated with agrochemicals. And although like he wouldn't like talk about it like as the core of his arguments, like it wouldn't be like a big part of like what they were saying, you could really see how that affected him and the people that were organizing there. And the fact that like he would have to, you know, endure like chemotherapy and surgery and having to go back home and trying to find out if they're fumigating or not, because that might be a hazard for him. So what are the main things that when I changed my whole, like, I wouldn't say I changed my whole perspective, but like the things that really stood up for me? One of them was this idea of how they are actually, a lot of this was about health, right? And about trying to regain control over one's own body and the awareness that our body is embedded in the territory that we inhabit. So whatever is being done to the territory, it it also is being done to us, right? And with us. So this idea, it really stood up for me when this person, who I named Gary, his name is not Gary, but like, again, this is something that we do in anthropology, usually changing the names of the people to protect them, was telling me about this one time that he had gone out of chemotherapy, and then he was trying to go back home, and then someone told him that there were gonna be fumigations. So then they ended up like going to somewhere else, and then other people from the grass organization stood there the whole night waiting to see if they would throw the chemicals, to try to find out what were the chemicals, to see if this would, what would that entail. And it was a very charged moment, right? It was very emotional, and it really struck me to realize how deep this was. Like, it wasn't about like, CO2, which is like, I'm not saying that's not important. I'm saying like, it was so embodied. Like, it wasn't like just, oh, I have conscious of the environment. It was like very much their own embodied experiences. And also something that I put there, which is this idea of our body is our territory and we want it free of agrotoxics. That was a campaign that was organized by environmental organizations 2 years ago. And it really struck me, the name, right? Like the slogan, this idea of like the identifying the body with the territory. And Michelle Murphy, she works here in Canada. She's an Indigenous scholar, and she talks about, like, she works with Lake Ontario pollutants with PCBs, but she has this idea that I really like of non-consensual exposure to agrochemicals. And this idea that we live in a chemical regime, we're all the time being shaped by chemicals, we're all the time interacting with those chemicals. And we haven't actually gave our consent for that, right? Like we are in that situation, either we want it or not. And another thing that was really useful for me was to think about one, like the framework of structural violence, and this idea of Poner, Cuerpo, which I'll get to there, promise. So I was kind of like thinking this idea of like how people that are being exposed to this violence and these chemicals need to put their own bodies as an evidence and need to produce evidence. And at the same time that they're producing evidence, they're being negated, right? They're being ignored and they're being gaslighted, which I'm gonna get there now in a moment. So they just actually they need to organize, and then they need to go and find authorized, quote unquote, voices to say that what they're saying is actually true. So this would be the case of Andres Carrasco, and all these different scientists are like trying to work with them and do papers and research and, academic frameworks that would actually, give a little bit more of like, again, like authorizing what they're saying. And this happens in the middle of like a very ingrained system of violence. So the idea of structural violence, on the one hand, helps us to think about a lot of the things that we go through are on the middle of a system that is already creating different situations, often like marginal situations or like impoverishment or not having proper nutrition or not having access to proper healthcare or all these different things that kind of like create a situation in which we're like actually more exposed to suffer from all of these different things. So when we get a disease, it's not only that we're getting that disease, this is in a whole structural violence system. But on top of that, in Argentina, and my guess it would be not only in Argentina, this is not only the only type of violence that we go through, right? Like there's also a lot of physical violence and a lot of threats and a lot of like people might lose their jobs, or even this person that I was telling you Damian Bersegnasi, the doctor that organizes encampments, the health encampments, he went to The Hague to be an expert witness in against Monsanto. And when he came back, the whole faculty, the administration of the university where he was, had his office. I wanted to kidnap all this different information they had, because they didn't have it digital by then, so they had it on paper, and they were trying to make them close. And it was a whole thing. They had to again organize. People started sending emails. It was kind of an international backlash out of there, from that, because a lot of people from different places in the world were kind of very outraged by that. So they ended up opening the office. But then he had to actually, when I went to do, it was kind of interesting. When I went to do the interview, he's in this tiny little office that you have to go through a mini, I guess that was not a washroom, but with sinks and stuff, or it was kind of crazy, and it really show you, it was very symbolic of the hostility that the university was having with the project that they were leading. So now he leads the Social Environmental Health Institute, but again, this is not seen very well by the university. At the same time, when he started the health encampments, he was doing that with the Ministry of Health of the province. After the first encampment, the encampment lasts 5 days, and in the last day, they usually give feedback to the community. Preliminary feedback, because they haven't had time to actually go through all of it, but preliminary feedback. Because they were doing that, the community started to get worried, because they were getting the feedback this amount of cancer cases that you have is actually not that normal in the rest of the country, it's higher. So then the Ministry of Health of the province tried to pressure them to stop doing the feedback, because they would withdraw their support. They didn't stop doing it, and then the Ministry of Health withdrew their support, but they were still able to carry this out. But it was again a very hostile environment. And at the same time, Guillermo, which is the third one, that the biologist that I also interviewed, he's also very much on that fight. He's very committed to anti-extractivist fights, not only with agrichemicals, but also with lithium extraction and other projects that are kind of similar, this extractive nature, polluting, not really caring about the consequences on the communities. And then he actually also, they tried to push him out of the university in which he was. It was the University of Buenos Aires. And again, they had to do a whole organization, open letter, people showing up, trying to stop that. And they were able to do it for now, but it's a very hostile environment in which people are committed to do this, are doing it against the administration of the universities, against the governments, and not with them. So, and then when I was talking with the people in the grassroots organization, they were literally telling me situations in which they were threatened, and in which people, someone that was an owner of a fumigation company or of a field that were producing soy, would go and be threatening to them, or they would go and try to talk to people in the municipality, and then they would see immediately after that the people in the municipality talking to the producers, pointing them out, and then signaling them. So what happens is a lot of people are afraid, and they would talk about this all the time. Even people that will say, yes, this is terrible, but at the same time they don't want to talk, because they know this is a little town, and then if you get in trouble, you're not going to be able to, maybe you have to, I don't know, you sell shoes in that town, so then you're not going to get they're going to start not buying shoes from you or stuff like that. Or even, again, physical threats. And when I was here, not in these towns, but in the north of the province, there was one of the people that were denouncing fumigations got her animals, her cattle was stolen. and put on the, like they left them tied in the middle of nowhere to be eaten by wild animals, which was a pretty, violent threat. Again, like you're not only damaging her cattle, like and like being cruel to the animals, it's a very significant threat to someone's safety. So this happens all the time. There's a lot of impunity. So I was thinking about this idea of how activism actually entails so much more of what we actually think or how is spoken about. It's not only about like having an idea and talking about it. It implies an embodied experience and implies risk and commitment. And this is what like the phrase poner el cuerpo is kind of like means that. Like when poner el cuerpo means that you're willing to put your body on the line. It means that you're willing to take risk and have an embodied engagement with that cause that you're trying to fight for. And then the gaslighting of the state is again Murphy. She has this idea of how the states and corporations that deny the experiences, it's not only that they don't do the research, it's not that only there's no epidemiological devices, it's that they're like literally gaslighting the people. They're like saying, we are going through this for years, and they're organizing and they're trying to create the evidence and the knowledge and the data. And then from the other side, it's kind of like, you know what, we're just going to go and believe whatever the company is saying because it's easier. So she talks about this idea of gaslighting because it also implies like a very intentional psychological harm that is being done to the populations. And also this idea, like thinking about how they want, this is what I was telling about how their own, the own risk that the scientists are doing. So this commitment that the scientists have is also poner el cuerpo. Like they're also taking a risk, not only because they can lose their jobs, it's also because they're also being threatened. And this idea, like also, it's also a bodily experience. So when I went to interview Rafael, like the exotoxicologist who works with frogs, he was just telling me, it was so interesting because he was saying, well, I was like more like a hardcore science, I was just like, go work with my frogs, come back. Like I was very into just knowing what was happening there. And then after transgenic soybean was approved, he went to this wetland that he kept going year after year. And when he got there, there was nothing. This is how he phrased it. I got there and there was nothing, just soy. And it really struck me because he said, I went to see mis granitas, like my little frogs, and there was nothing. So it really made me realize how even for a scientist that there's, again, this idea that they're like, from above, like, no, it's a bodily experience that they're having. And it really made me think how he would see nothing in a space that maybe I would just see green, or a crop. But he was seeing the absence of all these different beings that were there before. A whole system of beings that was there and it was not there anymore. And this is something that also Gary told me this one time, that he showed me how to identify a fumigated field, which is in the middle, that's fumigated. And he would explain that you can tell that because it's dry, but it's not only dry. You can tell because usually, because they do it on the field, you will see just next to the road on the other side of the fence that there's still, live plants. So it's basically the fumigants killing the field because you could be like, oh, maybe there was a drought or something. So I don't really know. Like, no, he was explaining this, and then also you can actually see the marks of the machinery that they would use to do that. And he said, you will start seeing things differently. He said, you will know that after this, you will start seeing things differently. And it really did. Like when I was coming back, I kept thinking about all these things. And I was like, I'm such an urban person. Like every time I would go to, anywhere in the country, and I would be going next to a field, and I was like, oh, green. I was kind of like happy at not seeing buildings without really realizing how much violence I was actually seeing and how much other beings were there before and now they were not there anymore. So this idea of like a life entanglement that was not there anymore, and there's only now one crop or nothing, as Rafael would say. And also like, even those trees there, again, I took the picture because I was like, little trees. And then the person that was showing the place was kind of like, well, this is actually like a forest barrier that they have to put 2 lines or 3 lines of trees. And then when they grow up, they can fumigate on the other side to protect the people. So they have to do that whenever that's close to like a space with people living in. Obviously, they did not weight it, and they only put 1 line, and then most of the trees were dead. Like they were like just a few. But again, I felt so guilty. I took the picture because I thought it was like a cool, like, I don't know, it's like, oh, trees. And then I was like, no, actually, this is a very, much like graphic scene of how this violence works. So this was like one of like my main takeaways from it. And then like I'm doing the PhD, so I'm going to be continuing the work. My whole idea is to see this in a time dimension, like see how this goes in time, because now I just went there and I spent 2 weeks, right? And I'm like following up, I'm talking to them, but I'm not really there. And now we have like a new right-wing government, so this is gonna get bad. And we have fascism advancing in the world, so it's a moment in which things are likely gonna get worse. And also because a lot of like anthropology is about relationship building. You have to build rapport with the people you're working. So how do you really do that in, such a short span of time? And even for me, when we talk about academic extractivism and how we like avoid doing that. And for me, like just going there, doing the field work, coming back, doing a paper and like leaving it there, even with the best intentions, even if you're talking about stuff that you think are important, how is that not academic extractivism if you don't really commit yourself? So for me, it's also about becoming an activist myself and taking that cause as my own. To be fair, I was already an activist, so I was kind of like keen to interpret it that way. And my other idea is to try to also go into seeing this idea of study up. So not only working with the organizations that are working against these corporations, but also trying to see how that works. From agribusiness representatives, but also there's a lot of people like kind of like in the middle, right? Like, so someone that goes and puts like a fumigation company that like works there and they like end up justifying this. So I think it would be interesting to try to see how they create meaning of their own practice. And yeah, I think this is basically it. This is a quote that I really like about of Lila Boulkhut, and it talks about this idea of like, what does it mean? What are the implications of the situatedness of our own knowledge that we're producing? So yeah, if you have any questions, this is the moment.
Yeah, thank you so very much indeed, Danny, for that presentation. We'd like to open up the floor for any questions from the audience. We'll probably start fielding one question first, and then if we kind of go around and if you have time for a second round, we'd love to field those as well. But Danny, would you like to moderate any hands and questions that you
Yeah.
feel that might be friendly-ish.
Should I do one at a time or like several?
Yeah, or whatever you feel, if you like take a couple at a time. Or
Okay, yeah,
whatever.
maybe, yeah,
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Danny. Always great to expand my knowledge in terms of anthropology and the complex nature that comes with anthropology. I really appreciated your positionality around like growing up in an urban environment and how that played into the work that you're doing now. And I think that speaks to like the importance of like bringing in more people who care about these issues. But one of the problems that I've seen with, I guess, Main Street activism, with like getting people in urban settings to care about their issues, they often tokenize people from rural environments, and they often like, they find the one sad story or the one experience that really galvanizes like a connection. How do you in your work or plan to in your work better encapsulate stories in order to mobilize larger populations without burdening or creating tokenization of the rural populations you're working with?
Thank you, it's a great question. Yeah.
One of the, thank you for your presentation, really insightful. I had a question about who owns these large fields and who is doing the tilling of the crops itself? Because I know when I think about like Indian agriculture, especially Indian rural agriculture, we see a lot more poor and caste-oppressed folks working in the fields, and environmental and financial issues crop up, and those are always sort of like localized to, by localized, I mean, India is largely agricultural country, but localized to poorer people. Are the people you're working with working in the fields? Are they living in the communities next to large crop fields? Yeah.
Thank you, great question. Probably should have like addressed that in the presentation. Okay, I'm gonna go first to Evans. So actually, Michelle Murphy, whom I was talking so much about, she really addresses this, what you were saying, this idea of how we keep relying onto, you know, re-victimizing the people and like putting them the burden of creating the evidence and doing the advocacy and talking about that. So she really points out that we should try to find a way to circle back to the corporations, and these institutions are responsible for this, and not rely so much into talking about the stories, but like pointing more there, which I feel like it's also one of the reasons of why I would like to study up a bit and go a little bit more there. For me, it was a contradictory like thing, because when I read her piece on that, I thought she makes a great point. At the same time, this is what they're doing. Like they're trying to be heard and they're not being heard. So at the same time, I'm kind of like, well, I don't know, like I do want to amplify their voices and help them out with like whatever I can. And trying to point out all these different ways in which this is damaging. But definitely, I think it's a really great point you're making, and it's this idea of like tokenization, right? And like just saying this, like, oh, this sad story that happened. But yeah, at the same time, we are facing like a gaslighting on the other side, and people saying, no, that's not happening. But definitely, I think it should be very, at least for me, I try to really point out how there's a responsibility from the corporations and from the state, and trying to point there and not as much on like people should like organize, like they're doing it because they just want to live. Which brings me back to your question. So the people that I work with were not workers on the field. A lot of them were like teachers, which is also interesting. It's something that I saw, and like reading other pieces, I find it that is one of the things that keeps like popping up, like the school, like, and the idea of like fumigated schools is something that is like very striking in the country, and like it repeats in a lot of different countries. And how like a lot of the teachers, sometimes they're like a lot of the teachers, they actually get help from the teachers union. So a lot of them are there. There's some other people that have their own agroecological project. And then other people from the grassroots organization buy from them their products. But I didn't work with workers, which I think it would be interesting. I do wonder like how the access to that would be like. I feel like it would be a little bit harder. I'm up for a challenge, but like, we'll see. And who owns the fields? So I was thinking on incorporating this to a presentation, but I didn't want to take too much space in explaining what the agribusiness model is about. But it was like, basically with this change in the incorporation of agrobiotechnology and this modified seed, they also started like using obviously different machines, and a lot of the way in which the fields were being managed changed, because now there was a lot of like transnational corporations that are like all around. So maybe they don't necessarily buy all the fields. A lot of times they're rented, but then, for example, the state gives a lot of subsidies if you are renting, or if you're producing soy with the Monsanto seed and you're using Cargill to do the distribution. And you're like, if you go with the whole package, they will give you a really big subsidy. So then it's very difficult for people to sustain other types of agriculture. And many times, even if they try to resist it, they end up like just because of the economic pressure of it. On top of the fact that there's so many fumigants that people that stay there, they're surrounded by fields that are being fumigated. So then their own crops, like, I don't know, you're trying to do pumpkins and then you're surrounded by fumigants. So then the pumpkins start dying. So it's like a whole combination in which they end up like a lot of times just renting to like someone. And then like the distribution is not really like, obviously most of the money is going to the corporations. But because of the economic pressure, people might just give in to that.
Yeah, I thank you so much for your talk. That was great. My question is a little bit kind of connecting to what you said about who the benefactors of this system are. And it's interesting because in comparison with Mexico, where there's a kind of gradual phase out of glyphosate by the Mexican government that has been met with significant resistance by small, medium, and large scale farmers. And actually, the Secretary of the Environment, Victor Toledo, was attacked and had glyphosate poured all over his house and his roof in 2020. There, at least in Mexico, there's been a lot of pushback from farmers to the state's plan to phase out this use because they have become so reliant on it. So my question is there any, did you find any kind of like international collaboration in terms of activism and resistance to this use? And other than Monsanto itself, who stands to benefit within Argentina from these systems? And do you know anything about how the state directly benefits from Monsanto?
Thank you. Great questions. I think there was someone else, or yeah.
And throughout your presentation, I was thinking about my own research, which is revolving around environmental racism. And environmental racism, just for context, is a term coined by activist and scholar Benjamin Chavez about the phenomenon of marginalized communities being positioned in closer proximity to environmental hazards, pollution, and being denied access to important environmental decision-making, often to their exploitation and expense. This occurs at two levels. You can talk about it in an intra-country model where you talk about Black or Indigenous or other racialized communities within a country being exposed to these kinds of environmental harms and injustice. But you could also talk about it in an inter-country model where you're thinking about through kind of neo-corporate imperialism, how globally certain populations are subjected more to this. So I was just kind of wondering about your thoughts about how this phenomenon can be kind of discussed through the lens of environmental racism, how there might be synergy with this term, if at all. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think someone else was doing.
One more if you want to build an extra one.
Yeah.
Hi, I would like to, in the meantime, thank you for the presentation, and also I'm an anthropologist and I appreciate your definition of anthropological research. And just a question, maybe a bad question. How do you think that your role as an activist could fit with your study app, your intention of study app to work with scientists that work in the agribusiness and people from agribusiness? And another thing that is not a question, just to highlight that is interesting, that people that has nothing than is their bodies use that for give proof of their the infrastructural violence that they suffer. And a colleague of mine is doing something like that with migrants from the. I'm Italian. My colleague is Italian. She is working with migrants in Mediterranean Sea, and how they bought bodies of asylum seekers is used as a proof of their asylum, political asylum seeking. And so I think it's very interesting, this setting, just this.
Thank you. Yeah, oh, great questions. Okay, I have 2 minutes. Okay, international corporations. Yeah, so this is what I was saying, that even though like there's obviously some corporations are like the bigger benefactors, some medium and small farmers would like oppose different changes, as it has happened years ago in Argentina when they tried to change some of the ways they were getting taxes from the exports. And this, I see it from the one side, because again, like the whole like system has been shaped in a way in which you don't really have another like you don't see another possibility if you're being kind of like extort to like, oh, either you can plant soy and like maybe survive or have some money, or try to do something else, but you don't have no subsidies and you don't have like any help. So I think that that plays a very big role. And of course, there's like very big agribusiness businessmen and women, I guess, that are like, I'm not naming them because it would be long and also kind of like not really to the point to go too much into it. But obviously Monsanto like allied with a lot of like important like sectors from like the ones that would be like the owners of the fields years ago. And some of them, they're still like owning like very big spaces and fields. And also like the state manufacturers, like actually this is one of the biggest problems, because what they would say, one of the arguments that the state would use is like, well, we get a lot of the money that we get from the exports. So because they're like the third export of soy in the world, they're kind of like, well, like where are we going to get our dollars from if we don't do this? So there's like a lot of resistance to think another ways of producing and another ways of engaging with the territory. And this is also, I think, ingrained in a larger, tradition of complicity with extractivist projects in Argentina. Like it's not only about soybean farming, it's also mining, and it's also like now specifically there's a lot of problems with lithium extraction, because these places are, very much in the middle of like places that have a lot of resources. Even you were saying, well, other international like when you were saying like help from other international scientists, I don't know if you were meaning like the activists or the corporations, but there's actually these people from the Ciencia Digna, they are organized with other groups from Mercosur, so from other countries in Brazil, in Paraguay, because Argentina is not the only one. Like Brazil is actually like the larger, like it actually exports and and produces much more soy than we do, and they have like also this problem, and also in Paraguay. So there are being like a lot of like organizing efforts on that sense. And they also have done UPSNAL, which is like Union of Scientists are committed to nature in Latin America. So they are approaching it. I know that. I haven't been able to go into that too much in the scope of the project, but I'm hoping I will be able to go further. Then, and this also like relates with this idea of environmental racism, because a lot of this different extractivist projects like directly impact indigenous communities, for example, in the country. And like this was very stark for me with the whole lithium situation, because there's a lot of lithium in the north of the country, and a lot of the places that they want to do the exploitation, so they're like advancing with exploitations, are actually either indigenous lands or they're next to indigenous lands. So yeah, I would have to get into it, but there's a lot of ways in which the state is basically denying indigenous rights to their lands to try to appropriate them and just do that. In my case in particularly, it was very stark for me that this grassroots organization, that a lot of them are like middle class, right? So the people that I was working with. And they did like they had like some samples of water analyzed, and they found a lot of agrichemicals. And one of the presentations of the results was in one of the schools. I was like in what we would call like a Navisha Miseria, which is like kind of like a what's the name?
Shantytown.
Shantytown, thank you. Shantytown. So it would be, so they did that in that school, and it was a whole thing because a lot of families showed up, because these are families that do not have the possibility to buy water. They don't have a car to go to the city and get water. So most of the people that I was working with, because they're professors, they have to go teach in Rosario. So they have a car, they go there, and they usually take water from Rosario to their houses all the time. But they have a car to do that. If you don't, it's kind of hard to get water from anywhere else. So obviously, like, they're way more exposed to the consequences because they do not have the possibility, for example, avoiding drinking that water. And it was very frustrating for them because also they did the presentation, but then there wasn't much of a response. They just put a water dispenser in 2 of the schools. That was like the whole response there was. And then they were like getting tap water. But then when I went there, it was still happening. And I think it's still happening. So I don't know how long like this also happens a lot. They might be like 5 years doing something that it could take not that long. And how to study up being an activist, it's a great question. I might change my name. I don't know. My guess is that agribusiness representatives would probably give me interviews because this is what they do. Like a lot of them, they do public facing. So they do want to have an opportunity to say what they want to say. But then I would, for sure, would have like much more of a problem if I want to go to like more, low profile people that are working there. So that's a great question. I have no idea how I'm gonna do it. It's a problem for
You can change place.
to change.
Yeah, you can try to change place, trying to go somewhere else to do this. Not with the same, right?
Yeah, the thing is, I don't think they know me. It's just like if they Google me, I'm
Yeah, it will. Be the
It's
same,
not.
yeah, absolutely. Maybe it's a bad suggestion, right?
But yeah, and then the other one of the asylum, I don't know if I got the question.
It's not, it was not a question. Just that people from migrants from all parts of Africa that trying to reach Europe through the Mediterranean Sea. They in the it's complicated, but European Union need to kind certify that you are a asylum seeker, right? And so they usually use the body, the sign on the body. Injuries prove that they're coming from places that they don't allow, for example, how to say, yeah, just so being homosexual, for example, or trying to, maybe they stayed in places in Tunisia and Libya waiting to come in Italy, and they suffer all kinds of tortures. So, and those are proofs of seeking political asylum. So the European Union can accept them through this, this path. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Just for time.